Hey y'all, welcome to our Thursday Manhood and Masculinity lecture. As I mentioned to those of you who were able to join us for our synchronous meeting on Tuesday, I always like to spend the last couple of periods of this class shifting away from some of our historical materials and to conversations about more contemporary issues in masculinity and masculinity studies, because I think, that there is a value to studying masculinity historically, but some of that value comes in being able to apply what we've learned about how masculinity has been constructed over time to our present situations. And specifically, what I'd like to talk about today are issues concerning masculinity and socialization, which is to say, I want to talk about questions about how it is in our current society that people come up with ideas about what it means to be a man or what it means to be masculine. And maybe I shouldn't say come up with, because I think, if anything, research has indicated quite powerfully, to go back to, something that Judith Butler has said, that we don't just come up with our gender whole cloth, right? We do not come up with our ideas about what it means to be masculine on our own. Rather, we are dealing with a kind of sedimented phenomenon. In other words, we are dealing with past remnants and bits of ideas about gender that have survived over time, that have continually evolved, but that in some senses have remained stable as well. And so I want to think a little bit about where we get our ideas about gender and how we absorb existing ideas about gender as we grow up, as we mature, etc., and actually throughout our lifetimes. So we've actually talked about issues of socialization and how images of masculinity or particular types of masculinity have been propagated over time. And here I'm thinking about our lectures, for instance, on the 1910s, where we talked about how Tarzan novels enabled men to experience a particular version of masculinity or a masculine fantasy that they felt was lacking in their lives. And we can see Tarzan as something that not only captured a kind of existing anxiety among men, but also helped to propagate a new idea about masculinity and how sort of white Anglo-Saxon men who otherwise felt a little bit beat down by their society might be able to reclaim some of their sense of themselves as masculine people. And we've also talked in this class about things like Charles Atlas's weightlifting ads that told men that the way to be masculine was to be buff. We've talked in our context of 1950s lectures about the impact of television and media, as well as things like magazines, on how men thought they needed to behave, right? How ideas about gender were propagated through those mediums. And so today we're going to think a little bit about various ways that men are socialized into masculinity, and I'm going to share a little information with you about some of the kind of theories that media studies and communication scholars have about this. But first, before we get into that, I want to take a moment to remind you of some important upcoming dates in this class. And sorry for the scary little clip art image here, but this is important, so I wanted to catch your attention. So we have 3 really significant dates coming up. One of these is May 5th, which is next Tuesday, so coming up quickly. May 5th is your last day to post discussion posts for this class. Now, if you have been coming to our synchronous Zoom meetings, you do not need to do this. Your participation in the synchronous Zoom meetings counts towards your course participation credit. However, if you are one of the many students in this class who have not been able to participate synchronously and join us for these meetings, which is fine, in order to receive participation credit, you are expected to post a short discussion post just showing me that you have engaged with the course readings or lecture materials from that day. And the last day that you can post these for our classes is going to be May 5th. And let's say by midnight or 11:59 p.m. on May 5th would be the last time slot that you can post those in. And again, if you want to receive participation credit for that day, you must either have joined us in the Zoom or have done a discussion post. So if you have not been doing those or not been keeping up with them, that is certainly understandable. I know you all have other things going on, but now it is crunch time and you are going to have to get those done in the next few days. The second important date that we have is May 6th. This is our last day of classes, although of course you have an exam period, quote unquote, after that. And I say quote unquote because we don't have an exam in this class. But May 6th is the last day of classes, which means that it is also the last day that you can change your grading scheme with the university. Now, you should have received communications about this from the university itself, but just in case you have not, I know you've had a lot of email lately, I want to explain something to you, which is that in light of the COVID-19 crisis, the university has changed its usual grading policies for the semester. It is now possible for you to opt to take all of your classes, including this one, as pass-fail courses if you so choose. Now, I am not an academic advisor. It is possible that there are courses on your schedule that you may not want to take this way because they count towards major requirements, etc. I would encourage you to talk to your academic advisors about any decisions you make in this respect. However, if you would like to take this class as pass-fail, that is certainly an option for you. And particularly if you are someone who has struggled to keep up with participation in this class or to keep up with assignments, which is a situation that a number of you find yourself in, it may not be the worst thing to consider taking this as pass-fail. That is, of course, up to you, though. I'm not encouraging you either way. However, if you would like to do that, you do need to opt into that by May 6th. So please see your email from the university for more information about this, but do keep in mind that that is the last day that you can change your grade scale. Now, the final date is Tuesday, May 12th at 12:30 p.m. This is when your final project is due. And just to clarify, 12:30 p.m. would be a half an hour after noon, because there's occasionally some confusion with 12 o'clock times. Okay, so a half an hour after noon on Tuesday, May 12th is when you need to submit your final project to D2L. Now, I know that some of you are thinking about doing podcasts or YouTube videos. That is fine. You can submit a document or submit a link to D2L to the assignments folder by that time, and I will be able to review it. This is, just to give you some context, the last possible day you can turn this in. I have scheduled this to be due at what would normally be our exam time, and university policies dictate that I have to complete all grading for the class and have your grades posted within 48 hours of this time. So by Thursday, May 14th at around 12:30 p.m., you will have final grades for this class. What this means is that you need to make sure you turn in your final project on time. And I hate to be a stickler about this, what with everything going on, I've tried to be really flexible with due dates, but this is one that just because of university policy, I cannot bend on. You have to turn in your final essay project by this time slot. And if you foresee any problems with that, I need you to get in touch with me, and we might have to arrange something like an incomplete for the class. So there can't be any extensions on this. I really need to be able to grade these on time. So again, if you foresee having any issues, please get in touch with me as soon as possible. All right. Now, to shift gears away from the boring stuff and towards the more interesting lecture content, we talked on Tuesday in our synchronous meeting a little bit about the documentary that you were supposed to watch for Thursday, which is Tough Guys 2, Violence, Manhood, and American Culture, which is a documentary that is heavily written and narrated by Jackson Katz, who's a cultural studies scholar and a specialist in media. Now, among other things, as many of you picked up on, this documentary has a couple of different arguments and a couple of different ways of using media. One argument that the documentary has is that media is responsible in many cases for perpetuating concepts of masculinity that emphasize what Katz would call certain toxic qualities in men. For instance, men are taught not to be emotional. Men are taught that it's better to respond with violence than vulnerability. Men are taught that they should be strong physically, and that sort of lashing out violently is an adequate solution to problems, and not just an adequate solution, but one that marks them as men. And Katz makes an argument for you that film and movies, as well as maybe our mass media, help to propagate, by mass media I mean sort of news media, I should have said news, help to propagate ideas about hypermasculinity that promote things like the cool pose, the tough guys, as he puts it, and that these sort of portrayals of masculinity have real-world consequences. And Katz wants to argue, among other things, that one of those consequences of this toxic form of masculinity that is promoted through the media is violence on the part of men, right? And he highlights specifically sexual violence and also mass shootings, which are such a big part of our news cycle most days, although less so now that we've entered the quarantine period. As I mentioned on Tuesday, we just had our first march without a school shooting in quite some time, and it is, of course, because school is not in session in person classes, which is depressing to think about. But Katz wants to argue that essentially this idea about masculinity helps to promote certain kinds of toxic behaviors, including violent behaviors. Now, it seemed from our conversation on Tuesday that a lot of you found the documentary interesting, but you are also a little bit skeptical about some of the claims it made about the influence of media. In other words, you made arguments which are arguments we hear a lot because most of us have lived through debates about things like violent video games or violent TV programs. I remember, several of you mentioned in our discussion Grand Theft Auto, right, which is always a topic of controversy when a new game comes out, etc. And what you said was, okay, but I understand that some of these things are violent, and I do think media can shape people's perceptions in a certain sense, but I don't necessarily think that media can be blamed for people's actions, right? People make certain choices. And I wanted to kind of expand on this point a little bit and give you some background in communications theory. And sort of media theory that might help us to engage more deeply with some of the concepts that are going to be raised in today's lecture and that were raised in the documentary, which, again, I also have some problems with that I may or may not outline in this lecture, but you can ask me about them in class if you weren't there on Tuesday. One thing that I think is interesting to think about as we kind of evaluate the validity of Jackson Katz's documentary or the validity of the arguments made in Tough Guys is something called cultivation theory. Now, cultivation theory was a theory that was proposed by a communications professor named George Gerbner in the early 70s. And what Gerbner was interested in was the effects of TV on Americans, right? Americans who, by the 70s, had fairly long-term exposure to television programming. So he's specifically concerned at the time with television. And what he argued as part of this cultivation theory that he pioneered was he said essentially this: long-term exposure to media gradually cultivates our perceptions of reality. Okay. And I think that this is interesting to raise because I think oftentimes when we have conversations about the effects of media on our ideas about gender or ideas about violence or sexuality, sometimes the conversation can be reduced to just because you watch a violent program doesn't mean that you will be violent. And that is true in the most basic sense. Yes, watching a violent program, watching a violent episode of TV will not necessarily make you a violent person. And certainly, even if you did become violent after that, it would be not clear that the television program was what caused that. However, there is a lot of research to suggest that while sort of single exposures to particular types of violent media don't necessarily make you violent, long-term exposure to media can play a really powerful role in changing what you perceive as social reality. And I want to give you some examples of that you might be familiar with and that might help to explain what I mean by this. one area that we might highlight as we talk about this is the campaign, an informal kind of campaign, but one thing you might see a lot on the internet now, if you happen to be on a lot of media forums or on Twitter, is you might see a hashtag or a slogan that's called representation matters. And the basic idea behind representation matters, and people who tend to use this hashtag or slogan, is they're often lobbying for more diverse representation on television. So, for instance, more TV shows that have Asian protagonists, or more TV shows that feature strong women as leads. It can be a variety of things, but the general idea behind this campaign is that what we see on television, the kind of stories we see reflected in our media, are really powerful, because what they implicitly tell us is they tell us what is important, who is regarded as the default, and who is regarded as worthy of attention, whose stories are worth telling. And if we don't have a sort of diverse representation on television, it can be, well, psychologically damaging, or kind of erasing of people whose stories are not well reflected, right? And so it can be very powerful for people in underrepresented groups to see representations, reflections of their lives on TV. And this is an implicit, that I feel like most of us, maybe I shouldn't assume that you're familiar with this, but I see it a lot. Representation matters. And I feel like implicitly this is our way of acknowledging that we have a basic understanding, even if we haven't read sociological research, or even if we're not well versed in communications theory or media studies, that what we see can make statements about what is valued culturally and what is central and important to us. We also have a large body of scholarship that suggests that long-term exposure to even particular television programs does have the power to change people's behavior. And I will cite one study that I don't know is necessarily contemporary to all of you. I'm not sure you are of an age where you would necessarily remember Jersey Shore, but Jersey Shore was this kind of terrible, I don't know why I said kind of, it was a terrible reality show that followed this group of people and their lives and sexual exploits, among other things. And this was a show that we might say, if you've watched it, had quite a lot of promiscuous sexuality in it, right? There was a kind of hookup culture going on. Well, researchers actually surveyed a number of people who had long-term exposure to this program, and what they found was that exposure to this program, in other words, if you watched a lot of Jersey Shore, you were more likely to engage in sexually promiscuous behavior than if you didn't. And this trend was more pronounced in younger adults than it was in older adults, but it was present in Jersey Shore viewers. So in other words, the implication is, in watching a lot of Jersey Shore, a program where promiscuity is in many senses normalized, people then had a social perception that engaging in a lot of sex was normal behavior, and they acted accordingly. This is just one rather silly example of a number of studies we have that suggest that when you see things represented on TV over and over and over again, gradually your sense of what is normal is shaped by what you see. To give you yet another example, and this one is extremely well documented, if you watch a lot of news, or if you watch a lot of crime TV shows, you are more likely than the average person to think that our society has extremely high crime rates, right? Because of what you are seeing in media. And some of you referenced this, I think, in our conversation on Tuesday when you said the news shows us very depressing things a lot of the time and can promote negative ideas about our world, right? And this is true. There's a lot of research to back this up. Now, if in case you're wondering, crime rates have been dropping in this country more or less steadily since 1993, so we are not living in an unusually crime-prone society. If anything, we're living in a less crime-prone society than periods that we typically think of as like an American golden age, the 60s, the 70s, etc. And so, that is not an accurate perception that society's crime-ridden, and yet watching a lot of TV about crime would inculcate us to that idea that it is, right? So it's not as simple, again, as you watch something it makes you violent, but it is to say if you watch a lot of violent programs over time, there is some evidence that that might function to normalize violence for you. And the same goes with gender. If you watch a lot of TV programs that only portray masculinity in one way, or that really seem to consistently highlight certain qualities, things like aggression, as being central to what it means to be a man, you are potentially somewhat more likely to embrace hypermasculine ideals. Okay? Now, the concept of hypermasculinity is interesting. Katz obviously focuses his documentary very heavily on movies and TV. And certainly, again, George Gerbner and others thought that television, because it was a visual medium, because it was sort of more immediately present than some other forms of media, was more powerful. But we also have a lot of indications that television isn't the only way that we absorb ideas about gender. Magazines, photographs even, can teach us quite a lot. And so I wanted to briefly discuss this by highlighting a 2013 article that was published in the journal Sex Roles. And this article was called An Analysis of Hypermasculinity in Magazine Advertisements. Okay? And that title should give you a really powerful sense of what the article is about. But in case it was not a big enough spoiler, what this study was a study of hypermasculinity. And the researchers who defined this term hypermasculinity argued that it had 4 key components. Okay? One of those components was the valorization of toughness as a form of emotional self-control. A valorization of toughness. And this should potentially sound very familiar to us from having studied the Katz documentary. The second one was an espousal of violence and aggression as manly. So in other words, the sense that masculinity was rooted in violence and aggression. The third quality was the embrace of risk-taking behavior and of danger as exciting. So part of being a man is engaging in risk-taking behavior and doing dangerous things. And the fourth one was the espousal of calloused attitudes towards women and towards sex. And again, all of this should sound somewhat familiar from the Katz documentary. It is also notable that oftentimes they're calling this hypermasculinity, but oftentimes we might refer to this particular set of masculine characteristics as toxic masculinity, would be another way to say this. And we say toxic masculinity not because, and we can debate the usefulness of that term when we talk, but we say that not because all of these qualities are inherently negative, right? Risk-taking behavior or doing dangerous hobbies like skydiving is not inherently a bad thing. And yet, there's been a lot of scholarship that suggests that men who embrace hyper-masculine ideas about what it means to be a man, who embrace this sort of hyper-masculinity, have a lot of social problems on the whole, or are more likely to have social problems than men who do not. To give you a sense of what some of these problems are, they have higher risk indexes in general. They also have higher rates of violence, including domestic violence, drug abuse, and suicide. On the whole. And so hypermasculinity has been associated with a lot of very negative outcomes for men. It is not the healthiest behavioral system. And yet, even though hypermasculinity has been associated with a lot of bad health and social outcomes for men, the researchers who wrote this particular article found that it was nevertheless glorified quite a bit in the type of media that they chose to study, which were advertisements published in magazines. Now, I think advertising is particularly interesting because I think the relationship between gendered portrayals and advertising is maybe a little bit different than the relationship between gendered portrayals in film and television. I said to you on Tuesday that one of my sort of I won't say objections, but one of my critiques of Jackson Katz's documentary is that I feel like he can sometimes be a little bit slippery with the way that he uses media. In some cases, he uses media simply to illustrate ideas about gender that exist in our society. So in other words, he will say, we as a society value this, and then he'll show you a media clip that would sort of exemplify that particular strand of masculinity. In other cases, he argues that movies and television play a very active role in promoting particular ideas about masculinity. And this is where I think it gets somewhat complicated, because I think it is highly possible for a TV show, a movie, or even something like a novel to feature a character that behaves in a particular way without condoning that character's behavior. So in other words, I think it's possible that some of these TV shows or movies that depict hyper-masculine characters are not necessarily depicting those characters in a way that's meant to make you say, yeah, this is what a man is. And the example I kind of brought up last class was Don Draper from Mad Men. I don't know how many of you have seen that program, but if you're not familiar, it is a television show that is set in the 1950s and 60s, at least during the seasons I watched, and it follows Madison Avenue advertising executives, and the lead character is Don Draper, who is very much a kind of hegemonically male character. He is, at the start of the show at least, a husband and father. He has a good high-paying job. He wears fancy suits every day. He day drinks. He's a womanizer. He has a lot of qualities that viewers sort of associated with mid-century masculinity and frankly with coolness. But I don't think the show was necessarily, in depicting the hypermasculinity of Don Draper, asking us to endorse that masculinity. In fact, I think in many parts of the show they indicated just how unhealthy and sort of stunted that form of masculinity was. So depiction does not equal endorsement. And yet, I think it kind of does sometimes when it comes to advertising, because advertising is in a much more direct way than television programs or movies trying to sell you on a particular impression of what gender is, of what your lifestyle should be, of how you should behave. And they're hoping to do this, again, because the message they want to send you is, you should buy our product. If you buy our product, you can be like this guy or gal. And because advertising has been such an important sort of vehicle for shaping our ideas about what our lives should be, what we should own, how we should dress, how we should look, these researchers chose to study ads in major magazines and to assess two things. One is how many of those ads promoted traits associated with hypermasculinity. So one or more of those 4 traits associated with hypermasculine gender ideals. And 2, how did the age, socioeconomic status, and education levels of the magazine's readership correlate with the number of ads that depicted hypermasculinity? In other words, was this more common in magazines that catered to particular demographic groups or ages? So in order to figure this out, the researchers' methodology involved examining magazines that had a circulation of at least 500,000, so big magazines, major ones, not sort of niche ones, and that had, by the magazine publisher's estimate, at least 70% male readership, so men's magazines, kind of. And they went through a number of images in these magazines and assessed whether hypermasculine qualities were present or not in any given ad. And again, this was the list of qualities. Now, as with any study, there are quite a few limitations, not the least of which is that they only looked at 8 magazines. Turns out that it's difficult to get information about readers' education levels for many magazines, and so they focused on the 8 that they could find that matched their other criteria and that had educational data, which really limited their sample. None of these magazines, notably, had a readership with a truly low household income, which may be a reflection of the fact that magazines themselves tend to be a more middle-class medium than TV or movies, right? If you subscribe to magazines, you're more likely to have money, right? And they also only looked at 2 issues of each magazine, which may or may not be especially representative, although notably those 2 issues generated over 500 advertisements for them to study. So, the results of the study are tentative and need to be taken with a grain of salt, but they're interesting because what the researchers found demonstrated a pretty clear pattern, and that's that advertisements that featured one or more qualities associated with hypermasculinity made up 50% of all advertisements studied, and were more common in magazines that targeted younger and less educated men or men of lower socioeconomic statuses. And you can see here the list of magazines that they studied and what percentage of sort of hypermasculine beliefs were present, or proportion of advertisements contained each of these elements of hypermasculinity. So I'm actually going to leave this up for just a second so you can study it, because I would love to ask you in class how you make sense of this list, or in your discussion post, how do you make sense of this list? What is surprising about it? And how do you account for the other finding of this study, which is, again, that these are far more common in magazines that target young, less educated men and men of lower socioeconomic status? How do you make sense of this? Okay. Now, I'm going to show you proportion of advertisements depicting hypermasculinity by age, education, and household income of the target groups, right? This is their sort of data on this point. So, I'm going to leave this up for just a minute. I'm very curious to hear why you think this was the case and how you would account for these findings. Before we transition to our Zoom discussion, though, I want to take a moment to go over 2 remaining points, one of which actually concerns the ways in which hypermasculinity, defined very similarly to the way these researchers have defined it, has started to crop up as a topic of discussion in media and academic coverage of the current pandemic situation we all find ourselves in. There has been some really interesting preliminary, but nonetheless interesting scholarly literature about gender, masculinity, and the COVID crisis. And I'm relieved to see that people are doing this, because actually when we made the transition to online learning and I started thinking about how I might modify the syllabus for this class, one of the things I really hoped to do was assign you some kind of article about gender and masculinity in the 1918 flu pandemic, because that seems to be the pandemic that most people are drawing parallels to as they discuss our current situation. And I was really hoping that might add a hint of relevance to our course materials, but I had a really hard time finding any scholarship. The only thing I found was one book chapter on Canada, and so I'm relieved to see that gender is entering the conversation about our current pandemic, although not for the best reason. So the reason that gender has been discussed a little bit more in terms of our current pandemic is that preliminary statistics indicate that while men and women are contracting the novel coronavirus in fairly similar numbers, men are dying of it much more frequently. Men make up about 64% of documented coronavirus deaths internationally. And some of this may be biological, right? If you read explanations by scholars about why it is that men are dying so much more frequently, one point that they often raise is that X chromosomes seem to provide greater disease immunity or sort of immune system responsiveness. And so because many, though not all, men have one X chromosome as opposed to many, though not all, women having 2, men might be more vulnerable to the effects of the virus. So there are some explanations for this that are biological, genetic, even hormonal. I saw an article the other day that suggested that certain facilities were considering estrogen treatment for men as a way to kind of help them fight off the virus. So interesting stuff there. However, if you read the literature on gender and the coronavirus, one thing you'll notice about it, including this particular article, which is the most recent one I read, is it also suggests that cultural factors play a very crucial role in why men are dying more frequently from this virus. And specifically, the cultural factors that various scholars have cited include a lot of factors that are linked in some ways to hypermasculinity. So one thing that scholars have said about why men die more frequently is that men are more likely to drink alcohol more frequently, and more specifically to binge drink. Now, this is an interesting point to raise because there have been a number of studies on binge drinking that have suggested that it is intimately related to men's embrace of particular ideas about masculinity or anxieties about masculinity. So, for instance, there was a 2019 study conducted in China that found that young men were more likely to binge drink if they felt that they had in some ways failed to live up to their cultural standard of what it meant to be a man. And similarly, there have been a number of studies of US men that have found that binge drinking behavior is linked to a couple of things. One is a desire to fit in among other young men, so to embrace a kind of masculinity that is not entirely dissimilar to the ones we have observed in this class with, say, jolly fellows. A very drinking-oriented masculinity. Consuming a lot of alcohol is, for a lot of young men, a way in which they prove their manliness in front of their friends. The second factor that it's been linked to is stress about failure to live up to particular standards of masculinity, including pressure to be a breadwinner and to support a family. Particularly for men who do not have a lot of employment prospects, perception of failing at meeting that particular demand of masculinity has been linked to higher rates of binge drinking. And binge drinking and alcohol consumption have been shown to make people less able to fight off the effects of the virus, or at least that is the current suspicion. The second thing, higher rates of smoking. In most but not all countries around the world, men are more likely to be smokers than women are. And some studies have suggested that this is in part an extension of a kind of particular brand of tough guy masculinity where men are more likely to think that they are invulnerable or not in danger from the consequences of smoking. And so they are more likely to engage in what is objectively a risky health behavior than women are. Additionally, there are some stigmas against women smoking in public in certain places because it's regarded as not feminine. And so men have higher rates of smoking. That makes them more vulnerable to the pulmonary effects of the virus. Men also, interestingly enough, have reported since this epidemic began lower rates of hand washing. So in a survey that asked people how often, whether they had increased the amount of times they washed their hands per day as a result of the coronavirus crisis, 91% of women reported that they had increased their hand washing practices, but only 85% of men did. And furthermore, there were some interesting predictors of what it was that accounted for that differential between men and women. Some of it is political. And so I'm citing here from a London School of Economics Center for U.S. Policy and Political Studies finding that said that men who were Republican, and of course men are more likely to be Republican in the United States, and men who supported Donald Trump were far less likely to wash their hands more frequently than men who were Democrats. And similarly, Democrats were more likely to wash their hands more frequently than independents, and much more frequently than Republicans. And so there's a partisan aspect to this that may not necessarily be gendered, although partisan politics tends to be rather gendered in our country. But there has also been a suggestion that in the face of crisis, and we have a lot of research to affirm that this is the case, men tend to respond to economic crises in particular by re-entrenching certain kinds of hyper-masculine behaviors. So when there is an economic crisis in this country, when the economy is bad, there have been some indicators that men are more likely to buy guns, they are more likely to resort to kind of macho behavior, and they are more likely to even sexually harass women at work during times of economic crisis, because resorting to that tough guy hyper-masculinity is a way of dealing emotionally with a situation that causes anxiety because we don't really have control over it. And so the tendency of men to resort to kind of hypermasculine tough guy behaviors in the face of crisis might mean that because of those hypermasculine ideals, some men are actually putting themselves in danger of getting infected with this disease because they don't want to be sissies. And to give you an interesting example of this, I was in the store the other day with my partner buying birdseed of all things, and I was wearing a mask, and at one point I was about to cross paths with a gentleman who was wearing all camo, which is not, a judgment call about this, but I'm assuming he was a somewhat conservative guy, and somebody who perhaps embraced relatively traditional concepts of masculinity, just judging by his outfit. But I paused to let him pass so that we wouldn't cross within 6 feet of each other, and he scoffed at me. And later on, when we were standing in line at the registers, everybody was spaced 6 feet apart, standing on the marks on the floor. And he decided that he needed to drop his enormous dog food bag right off by the register, even though he was several positions back in line. And so he came quite close to us and just said, "Oh, I'm dropping this off." And I took a step back from him. And he got very angry about this. And he said, "I'm not going to infect you, you sissy." So it's kind of fascinating. That's just one anecdote, but I think that there is a tendency for some people to kind of believe that they can tough out this virus, or that it is sissy to want to protect yourself from a deadly infectious disease. So I think this is an interesting finding. The other thing people have pointed to is that, in general, men are less likely to go to the doctor than women are. Men actually die from most treatable diseases more often than women do, because there is a sense that seeking medical attention is feminized in some ways, that you should be able to tough things out. And so, when we talk about hypermasculinity, there are, I think it's important to note, very real effects of this that aren't just related to gun violence or sexual assault. They're related to men's own health. Hypermasculinity has been shown to be not great for men. And then finally, and as just the last thing, I want to lead us into our reading by giving you a little bit of background on our author for today. You read a chapter of Dude, You're a Fag by C.J. Pascoe. Now, Pascoe is a sociologist who spent a year and a half observing students at a high school that she called River High, which is not its actual name. And I'm giving you this background, of course, because you only read chapter 2, so you didn't get the sort of methodology of the study. So this high school called River High is a Northern California high school that was located in a conservative community that was deeply divided between an old and a new section of town that in turn were divided by class. The new section of town was very ritzy. The old section of town, which is where the school was located, was poorer. And so Pascoe went into the school and observed the behavior of students and used it as the basis to write this study that you read for today. And one of the things that Pascoe really focused on in her book, which perhaps you picked up on from the title, is the centrality of what she called fag discourse to the establishment of masculinity. That is, she observed that young men at River High School use the word fag a lot, and in ways that she thought were very revealing. Okay? And so one of the things Pascoe does is look at the use of this word, look at what it means, and look at how homosexuality and the specter of homosexuality versus heterosexuality are used to define and inculcate boys into particular conceptions of masculinity. So that's what I want to talk to you about as we go into our discussion. Go ahead and turn the video off now. We'll do some Zoom conversation, and I will see you there. And if I don't see you there, I hope I will see you posting in the discussion forums soon. Have a good one.